April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above occupied France. The frost-bitten sky shimmered like glass as Oberleutnant Ralph Herrmaschen eased his gloved hand over the throttle of his Focke-Wulf 190A5. The hum of the engine felt almost comforting. Through the crystal-clear canopy he could see faint dots crawling upward from the west. The Americans had arrived. A crooked smile crept beneath his oxygen mask. "Milk bottles," he muttered into the radio, laughter crackling through his headset. "They've sent us flying milk bottles." Below, 16 bulky shapes climbed in formation. The brand-new Republic P-47C Thunderbolts of the U.S. 4th Fighter Group. Each machine strained under its 7-ton frame, the roar of twin-row Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines echoing through the thin air. To the German veterans circling above, the sight was absurd. Fat fuselages, stubby wings, and propellers the size of windmills. Against the sleek 190s, these newcomers looked like farm tractors trying to chase hawks. Yet beneath their awkward skins hid something none of the Luftwaffe pilots could yet comprehend. The very weapon that would one day tear the heart out of German air power. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would no longer be the punchline of hangar jokes. Their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns would carve fiery lines across the European sky, transforming ridicule into terror. At that moment, though, they were rookies, wide-eyed men facing a battle-hardened enemy. Major Donald Blakesley, leading the 335th Squadron, scanned the glinting German formation above. Only weeks earlier, he had been flying nimble Spitfires with the Royal Air Force. Now he sat inside an aircraft that felt less like a dancer and more like a sledgehammer. "Remember," he warned his men over the radio, "this bird fights different. Stay fast, stay high, don't turn." It was good advice. The P-47 was a brute, not a ballerina. Where the Germans prized agility, the Americans had built a fortress with wings. An engine powerful enough to punch through the stratosphere, and guns capable of shredding anything foolish enough to stand in their path. The sky over France shimmered with tension. Below, the Thunderbolts clawed for altitude. Above, the 190s waited like wolves. Between them stretched a few thousand feet, and the thin line separating confidence from chaos. What neither side realized was that the battle about to begin would mark the moment air combat changed forever. When speed, weight, and raw industrial might began to overpower the elegant maneuvers of the old world. The era of the Thunderbolt had begun. The Thunderbolt's story didn't begin in the skies over France. It began 3 years earlier, in a cramped design office in Farmingdale, New York, when news from Europe sent shockwaves through the American military. France was falling, the Luftwaffe ruled the air, and U.S. Army engineers suddenly realized they had no fighter that could survive in that kind of war. That's when a stubborn, sharp-eyed immigrant engineer named Alexander Kartveli, born in Georgia, the country, not the state, received a desperate telegram from Washington. The message was simple. "We need an interceptor that can fight at 30,000 feet and win." Kartveli looked at his small team at Republic Aviation and said the words that would define the machine's soul. "It will be a monster, but a monster with purpose." He wasn't exaggerating. What rolled out of the Republic factory in 1941 looked nothing like any fighter before it. The prototype, XP-47B, was gigantic. Almost 10,000 pounds empty, with a wingspan broader than some bombers. Pilots laughed when they first saw it. "You sure this thing flies?" they'd joke. But once that radial engine came alive, the mighty Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the laughter stopped. 18 cylinders thundered together, pushing out more than 2,000 horsepower. And when the massive turbo supercharger kicked in, the engine didn't just roar, It screamed all the way to the edge of the stratosphere. Most fighters gasped for breath at 25,000 feet. The Thunderbolt, however, could fight where the air was razor thin, at 30,000 feet, with full power. Still, raw power came at a price. The early Thunderbolts were beasts to handle. They rolled over on takeoff, ground looped on landing, and dove so fast that the controls froze solid. The aircraft even killed its own pilots in training. Between late 1942 and early 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost over 40 planes and nearly 20 men, without ever seeing the enemy. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of that group, once said, "You didn't fly the Thunderbolt, you wrestled it." But for those who survived the learning curve, something remarkable emerged. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, took the P-47 up for the first time and came down grinning like a man who'd just seen the future. "It doesn't fly," he said. "It charges." Inside that cockpit, the pilot wasn't a dancer. He was a brawler behind 8 blazing machine guns, each capable of spitting death at 1,200 rounds a minute. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed to be graceful. It was built for one thing: to kill and come home. While German designers obsessed over aerodynamics and turning radius, Republic's engineers focused on something far simpler: survivability. They wrapped the pilot in armor, gave the engine a radial layout with no fragile coolant lines, and bolted nearly half a ton of ammunition into the wings. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't elegant, but it was unstoppable. By early 1943, dozens of these metallic giants were being loaded onto ships bound for England. Most pilots had never even seen one before they climbed into the cockpit. And soon, the skies of Europe would become their testing ground, a place where design, courage, and industrial might would collide head-on with Germany's finest. The Luftwaffe still didn't know it yet, but the dinosaur with good proportions was coming for them. England, spring 1943. The airfields were soaked in rain, the smell of fuel and wet grass mixing into a scent every pilot came to know: the smell of waiting. Rows of silver P-47s stood motionless, their giant propellers glinting under gray skies. They were fresh, untested, and heavy. Almost too heavy. The Americans who had arrived to fly them weren't much different. Young, eager, and about to discover what real war felt like. When the first mission orders came, the briefing room buzzed with quiet nerves. The 4th and 56th Fighter Groups were to escort bombers deep into France. No one had done it before in a Thunderbolt. Major Donald Blakesley stood at the map, tapping a pencil against the target line. "Gentlemen, stay with the bombers. Don't chase, don't dive. Remember, she's fast going down but slow coming back up." A few men chuckled. They'd heard the jokes. 7 tons of armor, milk bottle with wings. But the humor faded as the engines began to start. The ground trembled under the roar of 18 cylinders, 16 Thunderbolts rolling down the muddy runway, each one dragging its weight into the sky. Then came the climb, slow, brutal, endless. At 25,000 feet, the formation stretched thin, engines straining, pilots sweating behind frosted glass. And then, like dark knives cutting through sunlight, the FW-19s appeared. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high." The radio exploded with voices. The Germans dove like hawks. The P-47s turned to meet them, but too late. 2 Thunderbolts burst into flames within seconds. Another spun into the clouds, trailing black smoke. "Johnson, on your tail." "I see him. I see him." The words cut off in static. From above, German pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. These big American machines couldn't turn, couldn't climb. Easy targets. Luftwaffe ace Joseph Pips Priller later wrote, "The new enemy fighter was massive, like a bomber that lost its way. It died quickly when hit, but God, it could take a beating. And that was the first secret of the Thunderbolt revealed. Even when hit, it refused to die. Lieutenant Robert Johnson learned that lesson the hard way. On his 12th mission, a swarm of Focke-Wulfs ambushed his flight. Cannon shells tore through his fuselage, oil flooded his windscreen, and his canopy jammed shut. He was trapped. His plane was on fire, controls barely responding, and a German pilot kept firing, again and again. But somehow the engine kept running. Johnson held the stick tight, praying, cursing, refusing to bail out. Finally, the German ran out of ammo and saluted before diving away. When Johnson's P-47 crash-landed in England, mechanics counted over 200 bullet holes. The armor looked like Swiss cheese. Yet the pilot inside had only a scratch on his hand. That day, word spread through every hangar and mess hall. You can't kill a Thunderbolt. The joke was dead. Fear had been born. The Germans no longer laughed when they saw the wide wings and bulky frame. They learned to respect it, and soon, to fear it. Because behind that thick metal and roaring engine was a pilot who now knew his machine could survive anything. And when a pilot stops being afraid to die, the war begins to change. England, June 26, 1943. The morning sky was calm, pale blue, the kind that hides death behind its beauty. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a quiet Oklahoma farm boy, strapped himself into his P-47 Thunderbolt half-pint. It was supposed to be a routine mission. Escort bombers across northern France, then come home in time for lunch. But war has a way of turning routine into nightmare. At 27,000 feet, the bombers droned ahead like silver whales in the sky. Then came the call. Bandits! 11 o'clock high. 30 Focke-Wulfs dove out of the sun. Tracer fire lit up the clouds. Johnson's flight broke formation. The world became chaos. Gunfire, smoke trails, twisting metal. Johnson saw a bomber explode, a friend vanish, and then a cannon shell ripped through his cockpit. Hot oil sprayed across his face, his canopy jammed, his engine sputtered, bleeding power. He was hit again and again. Through the oil-smeared glass, he saw a German fighter swoop in, sleek, predatory, confident. The FW-190 opened fire. Rounds tore through his fuselage, shattering gauges, punching holes the size of fists through the wings. Johnson's voice cracked over the radio. I'm hit. Controls gone. Can't bail out. Canopy stuck. His friends thought he was dead. But somehow, the Thunderbolt kept flying. Barely, wildly, but flying. Then came something stranger. The German pilot pulled alongside. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. Predator and prey. The German shook his head, almost in disbelief. He fired again. Short, merciless bursts. The P-47 staggered under the impact, yet refused to fall. The enemy fighter circled one last time, then saluted, and vanished into the clouds. Johnson's aircraft limped back across the channel, half dead, riddled with holes. When ground crews saw it land, they couldn't believe their eyes. The plane had taken more than 200 hits. Cannon shells through the wings, the fuselage torn open, even the tail shredded. But the cockpit, where Johnson sat, was untouched. He climbed out, covered in oil, shaking, laughing like a man who had just met death and survived. Greater than. She brought me home, he said softly, patting the metal skin. That moment changed everything. The news spread like wildfire through Allied airfields. A Thunderbolt had survived what no fighter ever could. Suddenly, the pilots who had cursed the big, heavy machine began to love it. They realized that as long as you were inside a P-47, you had a chance, even when the odds said you didn't. German intelligence reports soon began to note the same thing. Enemy fighter, new type, very strong. Repeated cannon hits ineffective. And so, fear began to shift. The Luftwaffe pilots who once mocked the milk bottle now called it the juggernaut. They learned to avoid head-on attacks. They learned, painfully, that trying to break a Thunderbolt only wasted ammunition. By the end of summer 1943, Robert Johnson had become a living legend, the first American ace to score over 20 kills in the European theater. But more than that, he had proven something deeper, that courage combined with engineering could rewrite the rules of survival. When his men toasted him that night in the smoky bar near Halesworth Airfield, he raised his glass and said only one thing. To the Jug, the beast that won't die. Laughter, applause, the clinking of metal mugs filled the room. But outside, on the dark runway, the P-47s waited silently, hulking shadows beneath the moon. They had earned a new reputation that day. They were no longer just fighters. They were symbols of endurance, of defiance, of a new kind of air war. And for the first time, the Allied pilots believed, maybe, just maybe, we can win this thing. By late 1943, the laughter had stopped. The Luftwaffe no longer mocked the bulky American fighter that once seemed too heavy to fight. Now, they watched the clouds more carefully, because somewhere above them, hidden in the sun, the Thunderbolt waited. After months of painful losses, the American pilots had learned a brutal truth. You don't fight a German fighter on its terms. You fight on your terms. It was Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke who changed everything. A thinker, a tactician, and a born warrior, Zemke studied the Thunderbolt like a chess player studies his next move. He gathered his men from the 56th Fighter Group and said, "Gentlemen, stop trying to turn with them. The Thunderbolt doesn't dance, hearing, it dives." That one sentence became a doctrine. Instead of circling and losing speed, Thunderbolt pilots began to fight with altitude. They climbed higher than the enemy, waited for a moment of advantage, and then, boom! They dropped from the sky like steel meteors, engines screaming, guns blazing. The Germans called it boom and zoom. A single pass, 8.50 caliber guns erupting, and then, gone. Back into the clouds, climbing again before the enemy could react. The first few missions using Zemke's tactics were devastating. Entire squadrons of FW-19s were shredded in seconds. One Luftwaffe pilot described it later. "We never saw them coming. They fell from the sun like thunder and then vanished." The name, Thunderbolt, suddenly made perfect sense. With speed on their side, the Americans began striking deeper, escorting bombers farther into enemy territory, hitting targets once thought unreachable. The giant turbocharged engines roared over Belgium, Holland, and into the heart of Germany itself. And then, the real advantage of the Thunderbolt revealed itself. It could dive faster than any aircraft in the world. German fighters tried to follow and found their wings tearing apart. The Jug just roared lower, faster, pulling up with brute strength that seemed to defy physics. Pilots started joking. If you can't shake a 190, just point the nose down and let God handle the rest. But behind the jokes was new confidence and new power. By the winter of 1943, the once clumsy American air wings were now lethal hunting packs. Thunderbolts led bomber streams, cleared the skies, and attacked enemy airfields directly. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin after years of victory, began to crack. Fuel shortages, new, inexperienced recruits, and relentless Allied raids made every flight a gamble. And above all, there was the roar, that deep, metallic thunder that echoed across the channel before dawn. Every German pilot who heard it knew the Jugs were coming. December 1943. The 56th Fighter Group claimed its 500th victory. A squadron once doubted, mocked, and nearly disbanded, had become the deadliest air unit in Europe. In a letter home, one pilot wrote, "We used to pray just to make it back alive. Now we pray for the chance to fight." That's what the Thunderbolt had done. It turned fear into fire. And in doing so, it gave the Allies what they needed most: air superiority. The sky was no longer a place the Germans owned. It belonged to Thunder now. Winter melted into spring. By early 1944, the gray skies over Europe thundered not with bombs, but with confidence. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, once doubted, once mocked, now ruled every mile of air between London and Berlin. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke's 56th Fighter Group had become legend. Pilots wore their flight jackets like armor, each mission patch another scar in the sky. The Luftwaffe still flew, but it no longer owned the air. Every takeoff was a risk, every sortie a roll of the dice. At dawn, the Thunderbolts lifted off from their muddy English airfields by the hundreds. The roar of R-2800 engines shook hangars and tore through the fog. Ground crews called it the sound of liberty. But the war had changed. No longer limited to escorting bombers, Thunderbolts now hunted on their own. Rail lines, bridges, convoys, anything that moved or tried to hide. Pilots called these rhubarbs, low-level strikes that turned the skies over France and Germany into a storm of machine gun fire and explosions. 8.50 caliber guns spat a blizzard of lead, and in seconds, trains carrying ammunition vanished into sheets of flame. Enemy soldiers dove for cover as the Jug screamed overhead, engines howling like thunder over the fields. That was the new face of air power: fast, brutal, relentless. The Luftwaffe tried to resist. They threw their best, FW-19s, BF-19s, at the oncoming storm. But by now the Thunderbolts were flown by veterans who knew every weakness, every trap. The Germans climbed to meet them, and the Americans simply soared higher, dove harder, and struck like lightning. By May, the victory tallies painted the truth across briefing room walls. The 56th, 78th, and 4th Fighter Groups had scored more kills than the Luftwaffe had replacements. And then, in June, it happened: D-Day. The invasion of Normandy. The largest air armada in history roared over the English Channel. Thousands of bombers, transports, gliders, and hundreds of Thunderbolts flying cover. From the beaches at dawn, Allied soldiers looked up and saw their guardians, silver wings glinting in the rising sun. To the men on the ground, the Jug meant hope. To the enemy, it meant death from above. All day the Thunderbolts swept over the coast, shooting down attackers, blasting tanks, torching fuel depots. In a single day they flew more than 2,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe tried to break through, and failed. Within weeks, German armor began to crumble under relentless airstrikes. Tanks burned in the hedgerows, trains exploded across the Rhine, and every convoy moved only by night, praying not to be heard by the growl of engines above. The Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible: total air supremacy. In the summer of 1944, the Thunderbolt was everywhere, massive, loud, and unstoppable. From Normandy to the Ardennes, every battlefield echoed with its sound, the deep, metallic rumble that soldiers called simply the roar of freedom. From the cockpit of his Jug, Lieutenant Robert Johnson wrote home one final time: "We used to fly just to survive. Now we fly so others can live." When he looked down through the canopy, he saw not just the war below, but victory taking shape. As autumn arrived and Allied forces pushed toward Germany, one thing was clear: the Luftwaffe's age was ending. The age of the Thunderbolt had truly begun. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. After 6 years of smoke and fire, the guns finally went silent. On the ruined airfields of France and Belgium, the once mighty Thunderbolts stood in rows, wings speckled with dust, bullet holes patched like scars of survival. For thousands of pilots, the war was over, but the legend had just begun. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more than 500,000 sorties across Europe and the Pacific. It had destroyed nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft, 9,000 trains, 86,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles. It had carried half the bomb load of a flying fortress, yet landed on runways barely long enough for a field cart. And most importantly, it had brought its pilots home. Even when the world wanted lighter, faster, prettier fighters, the Jug remained the symbol of something simpler: survival through strength. When peace came, the metal giants didn't vanish overnight. The newly formed U.S. Air Force redesignated them as F-47 Thunderbolts and kept flying them through the late 1940s. From America to South America, from France to Brazil and Mexico, its roar echoed beneath new flags. Some guarded borders, some trained new generations of pilots, and others, like the Venezuelan Thunderbolts, served faithfully for nearly 3 decades before being retired to museums. Their metal dulled, but their spirit alive. A few were lost in time, buried in fields or rivers. Years later they would be pulled from the earth, their aluminum bones shining like ghosts of another age. Back home, Republic Aviation built new dreams: sleeker jets, faster fighters, but the engineers never forgot the machine that had turned the tide of a world war. So, when, years later, they named their next great warplane, they gave it a familiar title: A-10 Thunderbolt II. A name reborn from the storm. Even today, the few flying P-47s that remain draw crowds wherever they appear. When the radial engine starts, the ground shakes, smoke curls. The old beast wakes, slow but proud. And somewhere in that deafening roar you can still hear 1944, the echo of courage, of roaring engines above Normandy, of men who once refused to fall. At air shows, veterans sometimes look up, eyes misted, as the Jug makes one low pass over the crowd. They see not just a plane, but a promise kept, that those who flew through thunder would never be forgotten. Its story is more than steel, oil, or bullets. It is a story about will, about endurance, about how even something deemed too heavy, too slow, too impossible could rise to change the world. So when the last surviving Thunderbolt lifts off into the sunlight, its shadow stretching over the crowds below, you don't just hear an airplane. You hear history itself, the everlasting sound of thunder.